The world we think we know is built on top of a much older one, a world so distant and so strange that even the people who first tried to remember it could barely describe what they were looking at. Long before anyone carved a statue or raised a column of stone, long before the great rivers of Mesopotamia were lined with cities and temples, someone pressed a sharpened reed into a slab of wet clay and left a mark. That mark was not a poem. It was not a prayer. It was not the opening line of some grand epic about gods and heroes. It was a number, a count of grain, a record of how many baskets of barley had been delivered to a storehouse on behalf of a temple that no longer exists. The very first act of writing in human history was, by any honest measure, boring. It was bookkeeping. It was the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet, a receipt scratched into mud and left to dry in the sun. But buried inside those oldest records, hidden between the lines of grain counts and cattle tallies and temple inventories, there is something that does not belong. There is a memory of a time before the record keepers themselves existed, a memory of a world before their cities were built, before their kings sat on thrones, before the very idea of scratching a symbol into clay had ever occurred to anyone. The people who invented writing, the actual inventors of recorded history as a concept, are telling us in their own words that there was something before them, someone before them, a world, or at least people living and building and ruling, long before anyone thought to keep track of it. Think about that for a moment. These are not modern conspiracy theorists. These are not fringe bloggers or late-night television hosts with dramatic lighting. These are the original scribes. The men and women who sat cross-legged in temple courtyards and palace storerooms and invented the entire idea of putting knowledge into a form that could outlast a single human life. And they are saying, clearly and repeatedly, that the world did not begin with them, that there were ages before their ages, kings before their kings, cities before their cities, an entire chapter of human existence that was already ancient when they picked up their first reed stylus and pressed it into that first slab of wet clay. And here is the part that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. We have looked for what they were talking about. We have looked hard. We have dug through deserts and drained swamps. We have sent submersibles to the bottom of the ocean and bounced sonar off the seabed. We have mapped buried landscapes with satellites and cross-referenced every ancient text we can get our hands on. We have used ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis and chemical isotope studies on teeth pulled from skulls that have been in the ground for thousands of years. And we still have not found what those first writers were describing. Not completely. Not in a way that settles the question once and for all. The mystery remains open, like a door that swings on rusted hinges in a house that nobody remembers building. Over the course of everything that follows, we are going to trace this thread all the way back to the beginning. We are going to look at the Sumerian king list and its impossible reigns that stretch back before any flood. We are going to look at Egyptian priests who described a first time, a golden age ruled by gods long before a single pharaoh ever sat on a throne along the Nile. We are going to look at what the Greeks inherited and possibly distorted from much older cultures who came before them. We are going to talk about Atlantis, not the cartoon version, but the actual text that Plato wrote and what it really says. We are going to walk across drowned coastlines and sunken continental shelves. We are going to stand in front of 12,000-year-old stone pillars carved with animals and symbols by people who were not supposed to be capable of building anything at all. We are going to look at a civilization in the Indus Valley that built cities with plumbing and grid streets and standardized weights and measures and left behind a script that no one on earth can read. And at every single step, we are going to test every claim against what archaeology, geology, and honest scholarship can actually prove. Because there is a difference between a good story and a real civilization. There is a difference between wanting something to be true and demonstrating that it is. Figuring out that difference is the reason we are here. Now, before we chase any ghosts, before we open a single ancient tablet or translate a single line of hieroglyphs, we need to set some rules. We need to be honest about what we know, what we do not know, and what it even means to say we have not found something. Because that last part is trickier than most people realize. What actually counts as a written record versus a myth that was retold for generations before someone finally wrote it down? What counts as a civilization instead of just a scattered collection of tribes who happen to live near each other? What does it mean when we say there is no evidence? Does that mean no physical trace exists anywhere on the planet? That we have searched every square meter of land and sea and come up empty? Or does it simply mean we have not recognized what is already in front of us? Because here is the uncomfortable possibility we have to sit with. Maybe the evidence is already in our hands. Maybe it is sitting in a museum drawer somewhere, mislabeled, filed under the wrong century, dismissed as an anomaly by someone who looked at it for 5 minutes and moved on. Maybe it is underwater, buried under meters of sediment on a continental shelf that no one has ever surveyed properly. Maybe it is beneath a modern city, under a parking lot or a shopping mall, in a country where no one has the funding or the political will to dig. Or maybe, and this is the hardest possibility of all, maybe it is simply gone, erased by 10,000 years of rivers changing course, glaciers grinding across landscapes, and seas rising to swallow entire coastlines that once teemed with human life. We are going to find out what the oldest writers on Earth were actually trying to tell us. And we are going to do it with our eyes open. Let us start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of civilization. The beginning of the thing that lets us know about civilization at all. Writing. The act of taking a thought, a fact, a name, a number, and fixing it in a material form so that someone else, days or years or millennia later, can recover it. We treat writing as natural today. It surrounds us. Every sign, every screen, every label on every product in every store is a descendant of that first mark in clay. But writing is not natural. It is one of the most unnatural things human beings have ever done. For hundreds of thousands of years, people lived, loved, fought, built shelters, raised children, told stories, sang songs, mourned their dead, and navigated entire continents without ever writing a single word. Everything they knew was stored in living memory and passed from mouth to ear, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of voices that stretched back to the very origins of language itself. Writing broke that chain, or rather, it created a second chain, one made of matter instead of breath. And the moment it appeared, everything changed, because now knowledge could outlast the person who held it. A scribe could die and his tablet could survive. A king could fall and his inscription could endure. A temple could burn and the inventory of its storerooms could be dug from the ashes 100 centuries later by someone who spoke a completely different language but could still, with patience and skill, figure out what the marks meant. That is the power of writing. It is the closest thing to immortality that human beings have ever invented. But it came with a cost. Writing did not arrive as a gift from the gods, despite what some ancient cultures believed. It arrived as a solution to a problem, and the problem was not poetic. It was not spiritual. It was not philosophical. The problem was that someone was stealing the grain. The earliest writing we have from Mesopotamia, from the city of Uruk in what is now southern Iraq, dates to roughly 3300 to 3200 before the Common Era. These are not epic poems. They are not hymns to the gods. They are not letters from kings to their generals. They are tablets covered in tiny impressed marks that represent quantities of commodities. Barley, beer, sheep, textiles, oil. They are receipts. They are delivery records. They are the kind of documents that would make your eyes glaze over if you found them on your desk at work, and yet they are among the most important objects ever created by human hands. A typical early tablet from Uruk says something like this: so many measures of barley delivered to so, and so on behalf of the temple of such and such. Over and over. Columns of numbers. Commodity signs. Personal names. Institutional names. There is no narrative. There is no drama. There is no emotion of any kind. Just the cold precision of someone keeping track of who got what and when. In Egypt, the story is almost identical. The very earliest writing, from the period just before and during the First Dynasty, does not appear on grand monuments or temple walls. It appears on tiny tags, small pieces of bone or ivory, sometimes no bigger than a postage stamp, attached to goods that were being placed in royal tombs at Abydos in Upper Egypt. These tags carry signs for oil, cloth, wine, sometimes with a place name or an official's title. They are literally shipping labels. This jar came from this estate. It was inspected by this person. It belongs to this tomb. That is where writing begins. Not in the halls of philosophers, not in the workshops of poets, in the storerooms of temples and the burial chambers of kings, among sacks of grain and jars of beer and bolts of linen cloth that needed to be counted, tracked, and accounted for. And there is a very good reason for that. Writing is expensive. Not expensive in the way we think of expense today, not in terms of money, but in terms of human effort. Someone has to be trained to do it, and that training takes years. A scribe in ancient Mesopotamia did not learn his craft in a weekend workshop. He sat in a scribal school attached to a temple or a palace, copying signs over and over, memorizing lists of words and symbols, learning the proper way to hold the reed stylus, the proper angle at which to press it into the clay, the proper way to form each individual sign so that it could be read clearly by another trained scribe. We actually have their homework. Tablets covered in repeated signs, copied phrases, exercise lists of professions and cities and gods. Some of these tablets have corrections on them, a teacher's mark next to a poorly formed sign, a note in the margin saying do this again. In Egypt, we have the same kind of evidence. School texts where students copy wisdom sayings and classic tales, practicing their hieratic script until their hands could form the signs without thinking. To become a scribe was to join an elite. In a world where almost no one could read or write, the scribe held a kind of power that is hard for us to appreciate today. He was the memory of the state. Without him, the temple could not track its offerings, the palace could not manage its workforce, the army could not count its rations, and the king could not record his victories for posterity. Someone also has to make the materials. In Mesopotamia, that meant preparing clay, shaping it into tablets of the right size and thickness, keeping it moist enough to write on but firm enough to hold a shape. In Egypt, it meant cutting and preparing papyrus reeds, mixing ink from soot and gum, sharpening brushes made from reed tips. None of this is free. All of it requires time, skill, and resources that could be spent on something else. In small, early states, that kind of investment only makes sense if it solves a constant, painful problem. And for the emerging temple economies of southern Mesopotamia and the royal estates of early Egypt, the problem was not how do we remember the distant past. It was how do we keep track of what is happening right now. Where did the grain go? Who received their rations? Who still owes tribute? Which fields produced how much this season? Which workers showed up and which ones did not? If your entire livelihood depends on redistributing food and labor from hundreds or thousands of people, memory alone is not enough. Oral tradition works beautifully for stories. It works well for laws, for genealogies, for the names of ancestors and the deeds of heroes. It is terrible for remembering the exact number of sheep transferred from one flock to another at the end of last year's tax cycle. You cannot recite 300 lines of poetry to settle a dispute over 14 missing goats. You need a record. You need something that sits still on a shelf and says the same thing every time you look at it, no matter who is looking. So the first texts are tools. They are not trying to talk to the future. They are not trying to preserve the wisdom of the ages for unborn generations. They are trying to keep today from falling apart. They are trying to make sure that the guy who was supposed to deliver 40 jars of beer to the temple of Inanna actually delivered 40 jars and not 37. That is why names appear on those early tablets. Not because the scribes were writing biographies, but because someone needs to be responsible. This worker, that official, this donor, that debtor. A name on a tablet is an anchor of accountability, nothing more. That is why offerings appear. Not because the scribes were theologians recording the mysteries of the divine, but because temples are economic hubs. The temple of a major god in an early Mesopotamian city is not just a place of worship. It is a massive institution that owns land, employs workers, receives tribute, and redistributes resources. So many loaves of bread and jars of beer to this god on this festival day, provided by this district. That is not poetry. That is a budget line. If you could somehow travel back in time and show one of those early Uruk scribes our modern obsession with what is the oldest story, what is the first myth, what did the ancients really know, he would probably stare at you with genuine confusion. The oldest story, to him, would be something his grandmother recited while grinding grain. Something sung by a blind poet at a feast. Something whispered around a fire on a cold night. Stories lived in voices. They lived in memory. They lived in performance. They did not live in clay. Clay was for things too boring and too important to trust to the fallibility of human memory. Clay was for the grain. But then something happens. Something that changes everything. Over a period of a few centuries in Mesopotamia, the writing system that was invented for barley and sheep starts getting bent and stretched and twisted to fit more abstract ideas. Signs that once meant only literal, concrete objects begin to be used in new ways. A sign that originally pictured a foot might start being used not just for the word foot, but for the sound of the word foot, which could then be combined with other sound signs to spell out words that have nothing to do with feet. This is the birth of phonetic writing, the moment when symbols stop representing things and start representing sounds. And that single shift unlocks everything. Once you can write sounds, you can write anything you can say. You can write myths. You can write hymns. You can write letters to people in distant cities. You can write legal disputes and royal proclamations and love poems and curses and prayers and complaints about your neighbor's goats. You can write history, or at least, you can write what you believe history to be. Egypt makes a similar leap. The same hieroglyphic signs that started out labeling jars and estates begin appearing in longer, more complex configurations. First in short formulaic royal announcements, then in longer inscriptions about victories and building projects, then in full literary compositions that were copied and recopied by generations of scribes. And the people doing this are not random. They are trained professionals, members of a scribal class that grows up attached to temples and palaces. They inherit not just techniques, but a canon, a body of knowledge and a body of text that they are expected to know, to copy, and to preserve. To become a scribe is to plug yourself into a tradition that already stretches back generations by the time you pick up your first stylus. This is where something subtle and important begins to happen. This is where administration quietly turns into deep time. Because if you are a scribe in, say, Old Babylonian Mesopotamia, roughly 1,000 years after writing was first invented, your exercise texts already include compositions that are old. Lists of cities arranged in meaningful orders. Lists of temple offerings that trace customs going back generations. And crucially, king lists. Sequences of rulers tied to specific cities and dynasties that claim to stretch back before any living memory. Those king lists do not start their story with the phrase "I was there." They do not begin with the modest claim that we have records going back to such and such a date. They start with something much bolder and much stranger. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an eridu. That formula does not sound like a warehouse inventory anymore. It does not sound like a receipt for 14 jars of beer. It sounds like cosmology. It sounds like the origin of order itself. It sounds like someone trying to describe the moment when the world as they knew it began. But structurally, underneath the grand language, it is still a list. And lists, in a scribal context, are not neutral. A list is authority. If something is on the list, it exists. It counts. It belongs to the official record. If it is not on the list, it might as well be invisible. So when scribes start arranging rulers and cities and dynasties into ordered sequences, they are not just remembering the past. They are defining what counts as the legitimate past. They are deciding, consciously or not, which memories get preserved and which ones get left to die in the dust. Over time, those lists reach backward. They reach beyond any records that were actually written during the reigns they describe. A king who genuinely did commission inscriptions in 2400 before the Common Era might be remembered with reasonable accuracy. His name, his city, the approximate length of his reign, these things might survive in contemporary documents that later scribes could consult. But a king who is said to have reigned for 28,800 years before a great flood, that is not based on contemporary receipts. No one wrote that down while it was supposedly happening. That is a retrospective compilation. That is later scribes assembling, reconciling, and sometimes inventing, in order to produce a smooth, authoritative line stretching from the very beginning of time down to the present day. And here is the catch. Here is the thing that makes this entire subject so maddeningly difficult. When we, thousands of years later, read a phrase like the first human records mention a civilization older than theirs, we are usually not looking at a day one inscription. We are not reading something that was carved into stone while the events it describes were actually unfolding. We are looking at a document that was put together long after the fact by people whose entire professional identity depended on producing a complete, authoritative, and politically useful version of the past. Errors creep in. They always do. A name gets misspelled. A number gets rounded. Two different local traditions about the same king get merged into one entry, or split into two, depending on which version the scribe had access to. Agendas creep in too. If a dynasty wants to claim divine sanction for its rule, its scribes might lengthen the reigns of its founding kings or connect those kings to mythical ancestors who ruled in the age of the gods. If a city wants to argue that it was the first, the oldest, the most sacred, its priests might emphasize temple traditions that place their founding before the flood, before everyone else, before time itself began. Because scribes copy from earlier tablets, because that is literally their job, those enhancements propagate. A mistake in one king list can spread through centuries of copies as students dutifully reproduce what their teachers wrote. A political rewrite in one generation can ossify into sacred chronology for the next 10 generations. By the time we encounter these texts, they look ancient and objective and authoritative. They feel like the voice of deep time itself speaking to us across the millennia. But they may actually be a cleverly edited memory, shaped and reshaped by dozens of hands over hundreds of years. So when a text from 1800 before the Common Era refers to antediluvian rulers, kings who reigned before a world-destroying flood, or speaks of cities and sages from unimaginably ancient times, we have to stop and ask a very basic question. Is this a contemporary inscription? Is this something that was written during the lifetime of the person it mentions, based on direct knowledge or recent memory? Or is this a retrospective compilation, part of a long scribal tradition that has already blurred the line between account book and origin myth, between history and theology, between what actually happened and what the scribes needed to have happened? That difference matters enormously. Contemporary inscriptions can tell us who paid what, who built what, who conquered whom in the writer's own lifetime. They are grounded in the specific, the verifiable, the mundane. Retrospective compilations tell us something very different. They tell us how much later people wanted their world to feel anchored in a vast, orderly, and often exaggerated past. They tell us about the psychological needs of the present, not necessarily the facts of the deep past. And it is precisely in that shift, from receipts and rosters to curated timelines, from grain counts to cosmic genealogies, that the doorway opens. A doorway through which later readers, including us, can walk and say, look, even the very first writers remembered someone older than themselves. The question, the real question, the one that will haunt everything that follows, is whether that someone older is a real, unfound civilization still waiting to be discovered beneath the sand or the sea, or whether it is the product of list makers extending their ledgers into eternity, reaching backward into the fog, and filling the silence with the echo of their own ambitions. Now we need to actually define our terms, because the word civilization gets thrown around as though it means one thing, and it really does not. When archaeologists use the word in a professional context, they are usually talking about a cluster of specific traits that show up together in the same society at the same time. Not just one or two of these traits, most of them or all of them, working in concert, reinforcing each other, creating a system that is more than the sum of its parts. The first trait is cities, not just settlements, not just a cluster of huts around a well. Cities, meaning permanent settlements that are dense enough and complex enough to require organized planning. Streets that go somewhere, buildings that serve different functions, residential quarters and market areas and public spaces and administrative centers all coexisting within a defined boundary. The kind of place where strangers live side by side and need rules to keep from killing each other. The second trait is writing, or at least record-keeping sophisticated enough to track debts, harvests, laws, and obligations across time. This does not necessarily mean a full alphabet. It can be pictographic. It can be syllabic. It can be a set of tokens or tallies. But it has to be systematic enough that information can be stored, retrieved, and understood by someone other than the person who created the record. The third trait is bureaucracy, some system of people managing resources and labor beyond the scale of a single family unit. Tax collectors, census takers, overseers, priests who manage temple estates, officials who allocate water rights, people whose entire job is to make sure the system keeps running, even when individual humans within it come and go. The fourth trait is trade networks, evidence that goods, materials, or ideas are moving across distances too great for any single group to cover on its own. Obsidian from a volcano 1,000 kilometers away showing up in a village that has no volcanoes. Shells from the coast appearing in graves deep inland. Pottery styles that spread across a region in patterns that reveal regular, sustained contact between communities that are too far apart to be a single tribe. A complex society can have some of these traits without having all of them. You can have impressive stone architecture without writing. You can have long-distance trade without cities. You can have organized ritual life without bureaucracy in the formal sense. These are all real things that we see in the archaeological record, and they are all important and interesting. But a civilization, in the strict sense that most archaeologists use the word, tends to have most or all of these traits working together. Cities with writing, bureaucracy managing trade, record keeping enabling taxation, taxation funding monumental construction, all of it interlocking like the gears of a machine. That distinction matters enormously for what we are chasing in this story, because it is entirely possible for a society to be complex, organized, even genuinely impressive without ever leaving the kind of evidence that we would recognize as a civilization in the textbook sense. A group of people might build stunning monuments, as we will see shortly, without having cities. They might trade over vast distances without writing anything down. They might have rich, elaborate spiritual lives and shared mythologies and sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and still not meet the criteria that an archaeologist would use to check the civilization box. So when someone says there must have been an older civilization, we need to ask which kind of older and which kind of civilization. Are we talking about organized communities that were more complex than we previously thought? Because yes, those exist, and we keep finding more of them, and they keep pushing the boundaries of what we believed was possible at various points in the human past. Or are we talking about a fully formed, literate, technologically advanced society with cities and government and writing, comparable to Sumer or Egypt, that existed thousands of years earlier and then vanished without a trace? Because that is a much, much bigger claim. And a much bigger claim requires much bigger evidence. Now the real question: how does an entire civilization just disappear? Not fade from memory, not get renamed by its conquerors, not slowly decline over centuries until it is absorbed into something new. How does it vanish so completely that modern archaeology, with satellites and ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis, and an army of dedicated researchers working for over a century, still cannot find it? There are actually several very ordinary, very unmysterious ways that this can happen, and understanding them is crucial before we start imagining exotic explanations. The first and most powerful eraser is the sea itself. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Between roughly 20,000 years ago and about 6,000 years ago, the oceans rose by something on the order of 120 meters. Not in a single catastrophic wave. Not as a wall of water sweeping across the land in a single afternoon. It happened in pulses. Centuries of relative stability interrupted by meltwater surges, when enormous ice sheets in North America and Northern Europe broke apart and dumped staggering quantities of fresh water into the oceans. Coastlines were redrawn again and again over thousands of years. Now think about where early human settlements would have been concentrated. Coasts, river mouths, estuaries. The exact zones where land meets sea, because those zones are biological gold mines. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, migrating mammals, fresh water from rivers meeting salt water from the ocean. Mild climates buffered by the thermal mass of the sea. Flat, fertile floodplains perfect for early agriculture. If you are an early human community looking for a place to settle down, you go to the coast. It is not even a choice. It is a gravitational pull. And then the sea eats the coast. Slowly, over generations, but relentlessly. Entire coastlines that once supported thriving communities are now sitting underwater. The continental shelves that ring every continent, those gently sloping underwater plains that extend outward from the shore before dropping off into the deep ocean, were once dry land. They had rivers and lakes and wetlands and forests. They almost certainly had people living on them. And now they are 20, 50, 80 meters beneath the waves, buried under sediment, scoured by currents, invisible to anyone who is not specifically looking for them with expensive equipment. The second eraser is rivers. Rivers shift course over centuries. Sometimes gradually, meandering back and forth across a floodplain. Sometimes suddenly, when a major flood cuts a new channel overnight. When a river shifts, it can bury an old settlement under meters of silt, sealing it away from the surface like a tomb. Or it can leave a settlement stranded in the desert, miles from the water that the people who lived there depended on for survival. Either way, the settlement disappears. In one case, it is buried too deep to find without drilling. In the other, it crumbles in the dry air and blows away, grain by grain, until nothing is left but a faint discoloration in the soil that only shows up in aerial photographs taken at exactly the right time of day in exactly the right season. The third eraser is erosion. Mud brick, the building material of choice across most of the ancient Near East, is essentially just shaped dirt. If no one maintains a mud brick wall, if no one replasters it and keeps it dry and repairs the cracks, it melts. Rain dissolves it. Wind abrades it. Within a few generations, a mud brick building can collapse and dissolve back into the earth it came from, as if it had never existed. You can stand on the spot where a 3-story mud brick house once stood and see nothing but a low mound of soil with a few potsherds scattered on the surface. The fourth eraser is the civilizations that come after. Later societies, when they build their own cities, tend to build right on top of the old ones. They quarry stone from abandoned structures. They flatten old foundations to create level building platforms. They tear down walls and grind the rubble into fill. They repurpose bricks and beams and door lintels. They erase the layer below them without even realizing what they are destroying. In many parts of the ancient world, a modern city sits on top of a medieval city, which sits on top of a Roman city, which sits on top of a Bronze Age city, which sits on top of something even older that we have barely glimpsed because we would have to demolish everything above it to get there. And then there is the preservation problem. This one is sneaky because it biases everything we think we know about the ancient world. Stone survives. Mud brick does not. A society that carved its temples out of limestone in a bone-dry desert can leave those temples standing for 5,000 years with barely a crack. A society that built with timber and daub and thatch in a wet, green, temperate climate can leave almost nothing behind after a few centuries, let alone a few millennia. This means our entire picture of the ancient world is wildly, hopelessly skewed toward whoever happened to build in durable materials in dry, stable environments. Egypt survives partly because Egypt is a desert. The pyramids stand because they are made of stone in a place where it almost never rains. Whatever existed in wetter, greener, more biologically active regions during the same period, societies in the forests of Europe or Southeast Asia or West Africa or the river valleys of South America, may have been just as sophisticated, just as complex, just as interesting, and left behind almost nothing that we can dig up and put in a museum. Add looting, add war, add centuries of people literally recycling old stone into new buildings, old metal into new tools, old timber into new ships. Add earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and wildfires, and you start to understand something that is both humbling and unsettling. The phrase "we have not found it" does not necessarily mean it was not there. It means we have not found it yet, or we cannot find it anymore, or we found it and did not recognize it for what it was. So how do archaeologists find cultures that left no writing at all? How do you study people who never inscribed a single word on a single surface? This is actually one of the most remarkable aspects of modern archaeology, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Ceramics are almost like fingerprints. The style, technique, firing method, clay composition, and decoration of pottery changes fast enough from generation to generation that pottery shards alone can date a site and connect it to trade networks hundreds of miles away. Find a distinctive type of painted pot at the bottom of a well in Turkey, and then find the same type of pot in a burial in Iran, and you have a connection. You have evidence that people, or at least goods, were moving between those 2 points at a specific period in time. No writing required. DNA pulled from ancient remains can trace migration patterns, population mixing, dietary habits, even disease. Isotope analysis on bones and teeth can tell you where someone grew up versus where they died, because the chemical signature of the water you drink and the food you eat in childhood gets locked into your tooth enamel like a geological barcode. If someone grew up in a coastal region eating seafood and drinking rain filtered through limestone, and then died 500 miles inland in a volcanic upland, their teeth will tell you that story. It will reveal movement and trade and cultural exchange that no text ever recorded. Settlement patterns, the size and spacing and layout of structures across a landscape, can reveal social organization even when not a single word survives. A cluster of small, equal-sized houses with no central structure suggests a relatively egalitarian community. A site with one large building surrounded by smaller ones suggests hierarchy. A network of sites arranged along a river, with one central site larger than the rest, suggests a regional system with a dominant center and dependent satellites. None of this requires writing. All of it is data. All of it tells us something real about how people organize their lives. In other words, silence in writing does not mean silence in the archaeological record. There are other ways for the past to talk to us. And those ways are getting more sophisticated every decade, as new technologies give us new ways to listen. This brings us to three possibilities that we need to keep carefully separate as we go through everything that follows, because they get tangled together constantly. Entangling them leads to confusion, and confusion leads to bad conclusions. The first possibility is a genuinely unknown civilization, something real that actually existed in the physical world and simply has not been found yet. Maybe it is sitting under sand. Maybe it is buried under silt at the bottom of a river valley. Maybe it is on a continental shelf 80 meters below the surface of the ocean. It was there. It left traces. We just have not stumbled across those traces yet, or we have not looked in the right place, or we have not developed the technology to see what is there. The second possibility is misread or mistranslated texts. Ancient scribes describing something that actually did happen, a real event, a real place, a real group of people, but describing it in ways that we are interpreting incorrectly thousands of years later. A title that we read as a king's name when it was actually an office held by many people over many generations. A number that we treat as a literal count of years when it was actually a symbolic or ritual figure. A geographic description that we try to pin on a modern map when it was actually referring to a mythological landscape that did not correspond to any physical location. The third possibility is a mythologized past. Real history that got exaggerated, compressed, or symbolically inflated over centuries of retelling until it looks like something far grander and far stranger than what actually occurred. A series of bad floods over several generations becomes the flood. A sequence of regional chieftains ruling small territories over a few centuries becomes a dynasty of divine kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. A prosperous coastal town that was destroyed by a tsunami and never rebuilt becomes a vast island empire that sank beneath the sea in a single day and night. Each of these possibilities has very different implications. The first one, a genuinely unknown civilization, would be an earth-shattering discovery. It would rewrite textbooks. The second one, misread texts, would be important and interesting but would not require us to change our fundamental understanding of the human past. The third one, mythologized history, is the most common and the most human. It is what cultures do with their memories. It is how stories grow. Here is the standard we are going to hold ourselves to throughout everything that follows. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That is a real principle in logic and in science, and it matters. Just because we have not found something does not prove that it never existed. But, and this is equally important, absence of evidence is also not proof of anything. A gap in the record is an invitation to keep looking. It is not a blank check to believe whatever we want. A hole in our knowledge is a question, not an answer. So as we dig into the Sumerian king list, into Egypt's first time, into Atlantis and the drowned coastlines of the Mediterranean, into the Indus Valley and the stone circles of Anatolia, we are going to ask the same question every single time. Is this a real trace of something lost? Something that actually existed and left a mark that we can identify and study? Or is this us wanting there to be more than there actually is? Is this the voice of the deep past calling to us from beneath the sand? Or is it the echo of our own longing bouncing off the walls of an empty room? When people talk about ancient texts that remember a civilization older than themselves, there is one document that almost always gets dragged onto the stage first: the Sumerian king list. On the surface, it sounds exactly like the thing we have been building toward. A neat, official-sounding record of who ruled Mesopotamia from the very beginning of time all the way up to the scribe's own present day. No monsters, no dramatic quests, just names, cities, and numbers, laid out in orderly columns like an ancient spreadsheet of power. Underneath that surface, The Sumerian king list is one of the most tantalizing and most frustrating documents in the entire history of the ancient world, because it starts in a place we cannot really test, and then slowly, over the course of dozens of entries, it walks forward into territory that we actually can verify. The versions we have were written and recopied over centuries. The composition itself probably took shape sometime in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, during a period of political upheaval and consolidation when it was particularly useful for rulers to claim a single unbroken line of authority stretching back to the dawn of time. The best-known copies come from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 before the Common Era. They are written in cuneiform script on clay tablets, in the same writing system used for contracts, letters, and those same endless grain accounts we talked about earlier. The king list opens with a formula that you hear echoed again and again throughout Mesopotamian literature. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not once upon a time. Not in the beginning, the gods made the world. Kingship descends from heaven into a specific city. And then, matter-of-factly, with the same dry precision you would use to list the contents of a warehouse, the list starts counting. Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Then the kingship passed to another city, and another set of names appears with another set of staggering numbers. Already, within the first few lines, something is obviously wrong, or at least obviously different from any kind of history we would recognize. These are not the modest reigns of frail human beings who get sick and grow old and die. These are not even the exaggerated reigns of boastful kings who add a few decades to their rule to impress their subjects. This is cosmic time. This is time on a scale that makes no sense for biological organisms sitting on thrones. The first section of the king list, the section that modern scholars call antediluvian, meaning before the flood, contains 8 or 10 kings depending on which version of the list you are reading. Their combined reigns stretch for tens of thousands of years each. Added together, the total span of the antediluvian period is so enormous that even in antiquity, it would have been understood as something more than a straightforward count of solar years. It is a number that signals something. It says this era is qualitatively different from the one you are living in. It belongs to a different order of reality. Then comes the pivot. Then comes the line that divides everything into before and after. Then the flood swept over. That is it. One line. One sentence. And after that sentence, the entire tone of the document shifts. Kingship descends again, this time to the city of Kish. The reign lengths start coming down out of the stratosphere. You still see some impressive numbers by modern standards. Some early post-flood kings are credited with hundreds of years. But as the list marches forward through dynasty after dynasty, the reigns shrink into the realm of decades and then single digits. You start recognizing city names that correspond to places we have actually excavated. You start meeting rulers whose names turn up in their own contemporary inscriptions, on bricks and cylinder seals and dedicatory statues. The list, in other words, transitions from myth to history, from cosmic time to human time, with a flood as the hinge. So what is this thing really? What were the scribes who compiled it actually trying to do? One way to read it is at face value. As a literal history of human rule from a time of god-kings who lived for tens of thousands of years, through a world-destroying flood, down to the scribe's own present. That is essentially how later Mesopotamian traditions treated it, and it is not far from how some modern fringe theories still use it. They take the numbers. They take the names. They point to the enormous reign lengths and say the Sumerians themselves are telling us that civilization is hundreds of thousands of years old. Why won't mainstream archaeology listen? But there are other, more grounded ways to make sense of the same document. And those ways do not require us to dismiss the king list as worthless. They require us to understand what it is actually doing and why. Those impossible reign lengths, for one thing, are not random. They are not numbers pulled out of thin air. They are built out of regular factors that had special meaning in Mesopotamian mathematics and religious thought. Multiples of 60, factors of 3 and 5, carefully structured totals that produce round, elegant sums in a base 60 number system. You can think of them the way you would think of the round, symbolic numbers that show up in other ancient traditions. The 1,000 generations mentioned in some biblical passages. the cyclical ages of hundreds of thousands of years in Indian cosmological texts, the 40 days and 40 nights of rain in the story of Noah. These are not diary entries. They are not someone counting actual sunrises. They are theology baked into arithmetic. They are sacred mathematics. The message is not that Alulim literally sat on a throne for 28,800 years without getting bored or dying. The message is that the first kings belonged to a qualitatively different order of time, a sacred era, an age when kingship was still fresh from the gods, still charged with divine energy, still operating on a scale that dwarfed ordinary human experience. There is also the political angle, and it is at least as important as the theological one. When the Sumerian king list was being composed and compiled, Mesopotamia had already seen centuries of city-states vying for dominance, coalitions rising and falling, dynasties overthrowing each other, alliances forged and broken, cities sacked and rebuilt and sacked again. It was a landscape of competing powers, each claiming legitimacy, each trying to argue that its rule was not just militarily imposed, but cosmically ordained. To claim universal rule in a landscape like that, you do not just need troops and chariots. You need a story. You need a narrative that explains why your city, your dynasty, your king has the right to rule not just this valley or that province, but the entire known world. The Sumerian king list provides that story. It does not simply say here is a bunch of kings we happen to remember. It says kingship itself is a single, legitimate institution. It moves from city to city in an orderly, divinely ordained sequence. When it passes to your city, to Kish, or to Uruk, or to Isin, or to Larsa, that is not an accident of warfare. That is not a lucky break. That is fate. That is the way it was meant to be since the very beginning of time. So those antediluvian kings with their superhuman reigns are not just background flavor. They are not just a quaint preface to the real history. They are the foundation of the whole argument. They anchor the entire institution of kingship in mythic time. They say that what we are doing now, this dusty, compromised, very human politics of rival cities and contested borders and shaky alliances, is plugged directly into an original, almost divine pattern. The kingship that your king holds today is the same kingship that descended from heaven at the beginning of the world. It has passed through an unbroken chain of hands, through a catastrophic flood, through ages beyond counting, and it has arrived here, in your city, in your lifetime. That is not just politics. That is a claim about the nature of reality itself. But buried in all that messaging, buried underneath the sacred mathematics and the political propaganda, there is a kernel that keeps nagging at people. A question that will not go away no matter how many times scholars try to answer it. Are these purely invented mythic forebears, figures conjured from nothing to serve a political purpose? Or are they distorted memories of real, much older political orders? Dim echoes of actual leaders who ruled actual communities in the deep past, their names and deeds warped beyond recognition by centuries of oral transmission and scribal editing? That question matters because of what happens later in the list. Once you get past the flood, once the rain lengths drop into the range of human plausibility, some of the names and cities in the king list start lining up with things we can independently verify. The city of Uruk appears in the list with a king named Gilgamesh. We have not found Gilgamesh's tomb. We have no contemporary inscription that says I am Gilgamesh and I did this. But the city of Uruk is real. We have excavated it extensively. The period when the king list places Gilgamesh is archaeologically rich with monumental architecture and evidence of a powerful urban center. The Gilgamesh of the king list may not be the demigod of the epic. He may have been a local ruler whose exploits were magnified over centuries of storytelling. But he is attached to a real place in a real time. Further down the list, things get even more solid. The list mentions a king of Uar named Uar-Nammu. We have his own inscriptions. We have his ziggurat, still standing as a massive ruin in southern Iraq. We have his law code, one of the oldest known collections of written laws in the world. Other entries, rulers of Akkad and Isin and Larsa, line up broadly with sequences that we can reconstruct from contemporary economic tablets and royal inscriptions found at the same sites. In other words, the Sumerian king list is not just fantasy. Parts of it demonstrably overlap with what we would call verifiable history. Other parts just as clearly do not. No one has ever found a contemporary inscription from a king who reigned for 28,000 years. And in between the clearly mythical and the clearly historical, there is a foggy zone. A zone where reign lengths are exaggerated, but not impossibly so. Where dynasties that may have ruled simultaneously in different cities are smoothed into a single linear sequence, as if they followed one after another. Where local traditions are harmonized, sometimes clumsily, into one big, sweeping narrative that is supposed to account for everything from the moment kingship descended from heaven to the day the scribe put down his stylus. So when the king list talks about kings before the flood, and when it treats that flood as a clean dividing line between two fundamentally different ages of the world, it is incredibly tempting to see it as evidence for a literally lost, pre-flood civilization that was wiped from the map by a catastrophic deluge. People have been making that argument for over a century, and they will probably keep making it for another century after this. But antediluvian in this context does not necessarily mean belonging to a completely unknown, globe-spanning, technologically advanced culture that we have somehow never found. It means belonging to a stylized age that has been deliberately set apart from ordinary time. It is like saying in the age before our laws, or back when the gods still walked among humans, or in the dream time. It signals a special status within a story. It tells the listener that what follows is qualitatively different from the everyday world. It does not provide GPS coordinates to a vanished continent. Could there still be faint political memories encoded in those early names and cities? It is possible. It is more than possible. Eridu, the first city named in the king list, is also the earliest known urban settlement in southern Mesopotamia based on archaeological evidence. That is not a coincidence that you can just wave away. The site has occupation layers going back deep into the prehistoric period, long before anything we would call Sumerian civilization had fully coalesced. When the king list says kingship was first in Eridu, it is pointing at a place that genuinely does have extremely old roots. Other antediluvian cities mentioned in the text, places like Shuruppak, have very old occupation layers and physical evidence of ancient flooding. Thick deposits of clean river silt separating one phase of habitation from another. The overlaps between text and ground are real. They are intriguing. They make you pause. But the presence of those overlaps does not force us into a single conclusion. It could mean that later scribes projected their own sacred geography backward into mythic time, taking real places that they knew were ancient and assigning them roles in a cosmic drama. It could mean that oral traditions about genuinely old, genuinely real cities were wrapped in exaggerated numbers and cosmic framing as they were transmitted from generation to generation. It could mean that the antediluvian section of the king list preserves a distorted but authentic memory of pre-urban communities and their leaders, filtered through thousands of years of storytelling until those communities look like something they never were. What it does not, by itself, prove is that a technically advanced, globally connected civilization flourished before the flood and then vanished without a material trace. That is a much bigger jump than the evidence warrants. And making that jump requires ignoring a great deal of what we actually know about how these texts were composed, by whom, for what purpose, and with what tools. What the Sumerian king list really shows us, if we are willing to look at it honestly, is how tightly Mesopotamian ideas about time, disaster, and political legitimacy were woven together into a single fabric. A primeval era of immense reigns. A catastrophic flood that wipes the slate. A reset of kingship in a new city. Then a long, ordered sequence marching forward to the present. That structure is not an accident. It is a deliberately constructed narrative framework designed to make sense of a messy, violent, and often chaotic political landscape. The flood in the middle of that structure is the hinge. It is the point where myth and memory do their heaviest lifting. It is the moment that divides the sacred from the ordinary, the cosmic from the human, the before from the after. And it is the part of the story that does not just belong to Sumer. Variants of a great flood, of a world before and a world after, show up in texts from across the ancient Near East and far beyond. Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, Greece, India, the Americas. Wherever you find cultures that lived near water that sometimes tried to kill them, you find stories about the time the water won. So to understand what the king list is really hinting at, to separate the signal from the noise, we have to follow the water. We have to understand what flooding actually meant to people living on floodplains. We have to grasp what it felt like to watch a river change course in a single season, to see an entire town erased by mud and silt, and then to turn that experience into the backbone of an entire civilization's prehistory. If you live your whole life on a floodplain, you do not need a global ocean to rise for your world to end. Southern Mesopotamia, the region where Sumerian civilization emerged, is essentially a pancake made of mud. The Tigris and the Euphrates carry enormous loads of silt down from the mountains of eastern Turkey and deposit it across a vast, almost perfectly flat alluvial plain. Those rivers meander. They split into distributaries. They abandon channels and cut new ones. They do not behave. They never have. When those rivers flood, they do not politely rise a few inches and then recede. They can move the landscape. A levee breaks upstream. A channel jumps its bank. In a single season, a settlement that has been sitting comfortably on the riverfront for generations can find itself buried under 3 meters of wet sludge. Fields vanish under standing water. Boundary markers disappear. Irrigation canals, the lifelines of agriculture in an arid climate, are choked with debris. If your village depends on a particular channel for its water supply, and that channel simply is not there next year because the river has decided to flow somewhere else, it does not feel like a local inconvenience. It feels like the gods pulled the plug on creation. That is the background radiation for every flood story in Mesopotamian literature. The rivers are always there. The possibility of catastrophe is always there. The memory of previous catastrophes is woven into the landscape itself, into the layers of silt that accumulate beneath every settlement, into the ruins of older towns that can be seen eroding out of riverbanks after a particularly bad season. Against that background, the great flood stories of Mesopotamia start to make a different kind of sense. The Atrahasis epic, composed in its old Babylonian form around the same period as some versions of the King List, tells the story of a God-sent flood that wipes out humanity because people have become too numerous and too noisy. The god Enki, who is sympathetic to humans, secretly warns a man named Atrahasis. He tells him to dismantle his house and build a boat. Atrahasis loads the boat with the seed of all living things and with his family. The flood comes. It destroys everything. After the waters recede, Atrahasis makes offerings to the gods. The gods, who are hungry because no one has been feeding them sacrifices during the flood, regret how thorough the destruction was. They agree on new mechanisms to control human population, disease, infertility, infant mortality, without resorting to total annihilation. The flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in the standard Babylonian version from over 1,000 years later, retells essentially the same story with a different hero. In this version, the survivor is named Utnapishtim. The pattern is the same. Divine counsel. Decision to send a flood. Secret warning. Boat. Survivors. Birds sent out to test whether the waters are receding. A sacrifice afterward. Divine regret. A new dispensation. These are not careful, day-by-day chronicles of one specific flood in one specific year at one specific location. They are mythic frameworks. They are stories that crystallize a type of experience, the terrifying sense that the known world can be suddenly, violently erased by water, and that whatever comes after that erasure is qualitatively different from what came before. They are told from the perspective of people who already live in cities, who already farm with elaborate canal systems, who already think in terms of kingship and temples and divine order. They are not saying once there was an entirely separate, technologically advanced global culture that vanished beneath the waves. They are saying there was a time before the order we know, and the thing that separates that time from ours is a catastrophe. Archaeology along the rivers of Mesopotamia shows us exactly why that kind of story had such staying power, why it was told and retold for thousands of years, why it became the hinge of an entire civilization's understanding of its own past. At sites like Shurapak, the modern archaeological site of Farah, excavators have found a thick, clean layer of river silt separating one occupation phase from the next. The layer dates to around the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Above it, new houses, new streets, a new chapter of urban life. Below it, an older settlement with different architecture and different pottery. The flood did not erase humanity. It interrupted a local chapter. People rebuilt, often on the same spot, sometimes shifting slightly as the water dictated. Similar flood deposits appear at other cities and villages across the region, but not always at the same time. One town shows a dramatic flood layer from one century, while its neighbor, just up the river, shows no such layer at all. Another site shows signs of gradual waterlogging and slow abandonment rather than a single apocalyptic event. The picture is messy. It is complicated. It is local. If you zoom out to the regional scale, what you see is not a single, once and for all, world-destroying flood. You see recurrent, sometimes devastating floods with local and regional impacts that, to the people living through them, absolutely could feel like the end of the world. If your town is underwater and your fields are gone and your canal is buried and everyone you know is either dead or scattered, it does not matter that the town 50 miles upstream is perfectly fine. Your world has ended. And when you tell the story of what happened to your grandchildren, and they tell it to their grandchildren, and their grandchildren tell it to theirs, the story grows. It deepens. It acquires cosmic significance. It stops being about your town and starts being about the world. That is how oral storytelling works. It has its own logic. It compresses. It simplifies. It sorts events into meaningful shapes. 10 different bad floods over 300 years can be fused into the flood. A vague sense that things were different before my grandfather's grandfather's time can turn into there was a world before the waters came, and a world after. Specific details are lost. Emotional truths are preserved. The terror of rising water. The miracle of survival. The sense that everything on the other side of the catastrophe belongs to a different dispensation. Time gets flattened in this process. Instead of a messy, overlapping sequence of minor and major disasters, migrations, and rebuildings, you get one big hinge in the story. Before, everything was different. Different rules. Different kinds of humans. Maybe different kinds of kings who lived for unimaginable spans of time. After, the familiar order. Your own institutions. Your own gods in their current arrangement. Your own laws and customs and ways of doing things. The flood is the wall between those two worlds. That compression is part of what makes catastrophic events so powerful as generators of prehistory. A big flood carves a clean line in collective memory. Before, after. Once you have that line, it becomes easy, almost irresistible, to start treating everything on the before side as not just earlier, but fundamentally other. A separate age, a different dispensation, a world that operated under different rules. You do not need to posit a fully distinct civilization with alien technology and globe-spanning trade networks. You just need a sense, shared across a community and reinforced by centuries of storytelling, that the normal rules did not yet apply. That the people who lived before the flood were somehow different from us. Bigger, stronger, wiser, closer to the gods. Granted longer lives and greater powers. The stories themselves encourage exactly this kind of thinking. In Atrahasis, the gods literally renegotiate the terms of human existence after the flood. Before, humans multiplied without limit. After, the gods impose constraints. In Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is granted a strange, liminal form of immortality and sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, outside ordinary human space and time. The flood is the moment when the current human condition is locked in. Everything before it belongs to a different version of reality. Meanwhile, the mud keeps lying. When excavators dig into Mesopotamian settlement mounds, they do sometimes hit what looks like a sharp break. Flood silt, then nothing for a while, then a different style of architecture. It is tempting to read that as old civilization destroyed, gap, new civilization appears. And sometimes there genuinely is disruption. Settlements abandoned for generations. Political centers shifting up or down the river. Populations moving toward more stable water channels or retreating to higher ground. But more often, when we get fine-grained data, when we have radiocarbon dates and continuous pottery sequences and detailed stratigraphic profiles, what we see is continuity threaded through the chaos. The same ceramic traditions reappear above the flood layer. The same deity names show up in the temples that are rebuilt on the old foundations. Family seals carry forward iconography that predates the disaster. The people who rebuilt after the flood are, in most cases, the same people or the direct descendants of the people who lived there before. They speak the same language. They worship the same gods. They make the same kinds of pots. In other words, catastrophic narratives can and do grow up around very real, very destructive events. But the people living through those events are usually part of the same broad cultural continuum before and after. The idea of a deep, alien, previous world, a world populated by beings fundamentally different from ourselves, can be a way of giving emotional and theological weight to genuine upheaval without there actually being a lost, unrelated civilization hiding behind the curtain. There is another complication that we have to keep in mind. Stories travel better than sediments. By the time the Gilgamesh epic was circulating widely across the ancient Near East, flood motifs were already deeply baked into Mesopotamian literary tradition. Those motifs then spread. Later texts in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Genesis tell a flood story with striking parallels to Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. Divine decision to destroy. A chosen righteous man. An ark. Animals taken aboard in pairs. Birds sent out to test whether the waters have receded. A sacrifice offered afterward. A divine promise not to destroy the world again. The similarities are too extensive and too specific to be coincidental. Many scholars see direct or indirect borrowing from Mesopotamian models, reshaped and adapted for a new religious context. The Israelites who compiled Genesis were heirs to a world deeply saturated in Mesopotamian literary culture. They took the flood story and made it their own, rewriting it as a narrative about their own God's relationship with humanity, but preserving the basic architecture of the plot. Beyond the Near East, flood stories appear in Greece, in India, and much farther afield. Some of these may be entirely independent responses to local catastrophic flooding. People who live near rivers and coasts experience floods. They tell stories about floods. That is not mysterious. Others may be distant, diluted echoes of Near Eastern themes, carried by migrants, traders, and storytellers along trade routes that connected the ancient world in ways we are only beginning to understand. Once a world-destroying flood becomes a standard literary device for talking about cosmic resets and divine judgment, it can be plugged into many different local histories. It becomes a template, and templates are reusable. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to trace any single flood text back to one specific historical inundation. Which flood? Where? When? The story has been told so many times, in so many places, in so many languages, that the original event, if there was a single original event, is buried under layers and layers of retelling. Like a fossil encased in successive strata of sediment, the original shape is still in there somewhere, but getting to it without destroying the layers above it requires extraordinary patience and precision. So how do historians and archaeologists even begin to link a story to an actual event, rather than to a pattern or a template? They look for a few specific things. First, geographic specificity. Does the text mention particular rivers, cities, or regions? Or is it floating in mythic nowhere, in a placeless landscape of gods and heroes? The Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood episode are both rooted firmly in the Tigris-Euphrates world. That narrows the search area considerably. Second, relative dating. Can we estimate when the story took shape, based on the language it uses, the literary traditions it participates in, and the political context of its composition? Does that estimated date roughly line up with major flood episodes in the same geographic area? The old Babylonian Atrahasis overlaps in time with some of those late 3rd millennium flood deposits in southern Mesopotamia. But that still gives us a window of centuries, not a specific day and hour. Third, archaeological signatures. Do we see widespread flood layers across many sites at once, followed by consistent patterns of rebuilding or abandonment? Or are we seeing a patchwork of local events at different times in different places, events that were later stitched together into a single unified narrative by storytellers and scribes? Fourth, uniqueness. Is there something about a particular flood, its scale, its associated destruction of political centers, its connection to a known dynasty collapse, that would plausibly make it stand out in memory compared to all the other floods that came before and after? Or is the story more like a composite, a greatest hits collection of every bad flood anyone in the region had ever endured? Even when some of these criteria line up, most specialists remain cautious. At best, we can say with reasonable confidence that Mesopotamian flood stories probably grew out of repeated, cumulative experiences with severe riverine flooding in a landscape that made those floods feel like the end of the world. We can see how those experiences, told and retold and shaped and reshaped over centuries, hardened into a single grand narrative of one great flood that cleanly separates a hazy, sacred before from the structured, documented after. What we cannot do, based on the existing evidence, is point to the Atrahasis epic or the Sumerian king list and say this text definitively encodes the memory of Civilization X, a fully formed, technologically advanced society that existed 10,000 years before Sumer and vanished overnight in a catastrophic deluge. That is a story we are telling ourselves. The texts are telling a different story, a story about how real people, living in a real landscape that periodically tried to kill them, made sense of their own vulnerability by dividing time into a sacred before and a familiar after. The floods give us boundaries in the story. They give later people a way to imagine a deep, alien, earlier world. But the names attached to that earlier world, names like Eridu and Sapar, are still anchored in real cities that we can actually dig. And when we go to those cities and put our trowels in the dirt, the ground tells a more complicated, more continuous, and ultimately more interesting story than the myths would have us believe. When the Sumerian king list talks about the cities of the antediluvian period, when it says kingship was in Eridu or kingship was in Bad Tibra, it does not leave that earlier world as a vague abstraction. It hangs specific names on it. Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sapar, Shurapak. Those are the antediluvian cities where kingship supposedly descended from heaven and moved from one place to another long before any dynasty that we can actually document with contemporary inscriptions. Later hymns and temple inscriptions echo that same sacred geography. Some cities are just cities, important but ordinary. A few, though, are treated as primordial. They are described as if they were built at the dawn of time, as if they belong to an order of existence that is fundamentally older and more sacred than the present one. And that is where things get genuinely interesting, because several of those places are real. They are not mythical mountains floating in the clouds. They are physical sites in the alluvial plain of southern Iraq. We have dug them. We have found bricks stamped with royal names, temple foundations, city walls, domestic garbage, pottery, animal bones, the whole unglamorous archive that tells you real people lived real lives in a real place. But the way the texts talk about those places does not always line up neatly with what comes out of the ground. Take Eridu. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu is the first city, the oldest, the place where kingship descended from heaven for the very first time, the home of the god Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom. Later lists of temples describe its great sanctuary, the Iabzu, in almost nostalgic terms, as if even in the scribe's own day it already belonged to a more ancient world, a world that was receding into the past even as they tried to describe it. Excavations at the site identified as Eridu, a substantial mound in the southern alluvium, do show genuinely impressive antiquity. The site has a deep sequence of temple platforms, one built on top of another, going back into the Ubaid period, a time that predates what we usually call Sumerian civilization by many centuries. Eridu is one of the earliest known monumental cult centers in all of southern Mesopotamia. That is a genuinely significant archaeological fact. It tells us that people were gathering at this spot and building structures of ritual importance for a very, very long time. But if you are looking for a single, unmistakable first city layer that matches the mythic Eridu of the king list, that moment when kingship dropped out of heaven like a stone and landed in this precise spot, you do not find it. What you see instead is gradual growth. A small cult focus, maybe a simple shrine or an offering place, becomes a larger shrine over time. Shrines accumulate offerings and rebuildings. Houses cluster nearby. Over centuries, those layers stack up, one on top of another, into the mound that later excavators would cut through with their trenches. The firstness of Eridu in the texts maps loosely onto its real role as one of the earliest sacred centers in the region. But it does not map onto a clean archaeological dividing line where urban life suddenly appears overnight, like a light being switched on in a dark room. The transition from small shrine to major cult center to proto-urban settlement is gradual, messy, and spans centuries or even millennia. There is no single stratum where you can stick a pin and say here, this is the moment the city began. So is the text wrong? Not exactly. It is doing something different from what a modern historian would do. It is taking a real place with genuinely deep roots and elevating it into a cosmic anchor point. First city in this context is less a strict chronological statement. This was literally the first cluster of buildings on Earth, and more a theological one. This is the place where order, kingship, and proper ritual first crystallized out of primordial chaos. This is the point where the divine plan first touched the ground. Sippar shows a different kind of problem. In later Babylonian tradition, Sippar is another important cult center, associated with the sun god Shamash. It appears on the king list as an antediluvian city. We know of a historical Sippar in the Old Babylonian period and later, and we have archaeological remains at sites identified as Sippar. But when scribes in, say, the first millennium before the Common Era copy a list saying kingship was in Sippar before the flood, are they pointing at the same physical hill that we are excavating today? Or has the name moved? Place names can be slippery in a way that modern people, accustomed to fixed addresses and satellite maps, find hard to grasp. Rivers shift. Canals silt up. Political centers move a few kilometers to higher ground when the old site becomes too waterlogged or too exposed. The old place name might get applied to the new spot, or the sacred name might stay put while the administrative functions move elsewhere. Sometimes an entire settlement shifts to a new location while the old place name trails along behind it like a shadow. Other times, the original cult site stays exactly where it is, anchored by a sacred well or a sacred mound, while the living city grows up somewhere nearby and eventually claims the old name for itself. Over a period of a few thousand years, this process can leave you with one name attached to multiple mounds, or a single mound that has worn several different names at different periods in its history. Sorting out which is which requires painstaking work, comparing inscriptions, pottery sequences, geographic descriptions and texts, and the physical layout of the land itself. That is where the problem of tells becomes relevant. Most ancient Mesopotamian cities that survive in the archaeological record survive as tells. A tell is not a natural hill. It is an artificial mound, built up over centuries or millennia by the cumulative effect of human habitation. Every generation builds on top of the previous one. New mud brick houses are constructed on the collapsed and leveled remains of old mud brick houses. New temple platforms are raised on the flattened foundations of earlier temples. New streets are laid a meter above the old ones. Each new phase of construction raises the ground level slightly, and over time, the accumulated layers of construction, collapse, fill, and reconstruction create a substantial hill. If you walk on top of a big tell today, you are standing on the latest version of that city, the most recent buildings, the final phase of occupation. To get to the earliest layers, the first structures that were ever built on that spot, you have to dig down through all the younger layers above them. But those younger layers are often the ones that contain the most impressive architecture. Big stone foundations, fired brick walls, monumental buildings that are thick and solid enough to survive for millennia. The very first phases, at the bottom of the mound, may be thin surfaces of trampled mud, fragile reed structures that have left almost no trace, small early shrines made of materials that decompose quickly in the moist, warm soil of a river floodplain. They are easy to miss, easy to dig through without realizing what you have just destroyed. So what does it even mean to say we have not found a city that is mentioned in an ancient list or myth? It does not always mean the place never existed. It might mean we have only excavated the upper few meters of a mound, and the earliest levels are still buried deep below, inaccessible because they are beneath a modern village, or beneath an irrigation canal, or beneath a water table that makes digging impossible without pumps and waterproof shoring that no one can afford. It might mean the site has been eroded away, plowed out by centuries of farming, buried under later canal systems, dissolved by rising salinity in the soil. It might mean the name has migrated, and the mound that actually preserves the relevant archaeological phase is sitting under a different modern place named 50 kilometers away, unexcavated because no one realized it was important. It might mean the text is telescoping multiple real sites into a single legendary location, compressing a whole landscape of sacred places into one name for narrative convenience. When scholars try to match a name on a clay tablet to a hill in the landscape, they do not just shrug and guess. They use a substantial toolkit. Phonetics. How would that Sumerian or Akkadian place name likely have sounded when it was spoken aloud? How could it have shifted over time as languages changed, as scribes in later periods wrote it in Babylonian or Assyrian or Greek or Arabic? Can we trace a linguistic chain from the ancient name to a modern toponym that still clings to a site today? Geography. What does the text say about where this city lies in relation to rivers, other cities, or regional landmarks? Does that description fit known ancient canal systems, trade routes, or environmental reconstructions of what the landscape looked like at the relevant period? Later references. Do first millennium scholars, geographers, temple lists, or administrative records associate the same name with a known district, a specific deity cult, or a recognizable geographic feature that we can track in the archaeological record? Material culture. When we dig at candidate sites, does the pottery, architecture, layout, and date range match what we would expect for a city of that name at the period the text is talking about? Do we find inscriptions on bricks or tablets that actually use the place name we are looking for? Even with all of those tools, unfound remains a moving target. A place that was purely literary in 1920, a name that scholars assumed was mythical because no one had found a corresponding site, can suddenly become very real when a new satellite image reveals a suspicious pattern of mounds, or when a new cuneiform tablet turns up with a clear geographic description tying the name to a known region. A city that was confidently identified in the mid-20th century can be reassigned to a different site when fresh excavations reveal that the pottery sequence is off by several centuries. In the ancient Near East, the gap between text and dirt is constantly being renegotiated. What we know about the past is not fixed. It is a moving frontier. New evidence arrives. Old interpretations are revised. The map of the ancient world is being redrawn in real time, every year, by every team that puts a shovel into the ground. So when an early list talks about Eridu or Sippar as antediluvian, as older than the world we know, we are not automatically looking at evidence for a ghost civilization that left no trace. We are looking at real cities whose earliest chapters are compressed, mythologized, and sometimes displaced in memory. Some of those early layers may still be buried, waiting patiently beneath meters of later construction for someone with the funding and the patience to reach them. Some may have melted back into the mud that they were built from, leaving nothing that a trowel can find. Some may never be cleanly separable from the normal, gradual continuum of settlement that surrounds them. The mystery is not always that we cannot find the place at all. Very often, the mystery is that the place we can find refuses to match the story in a simple, satisfying way. The dirt is always more complicated than the tale. The layers are always messier than the list. The transition from nothing to something is always more gradual than the scribes want it to be. And that mismatch, that gap between the clean narrative and the messy evidence, is not a flaw. It is the most interesting thing about the whole enterprise. It is the place where real understanding lies. Egypt has its own way of performing this time before time move. If Mesopotamian scribes talk about antediluvian cities and cosmic kings, Egyptian priests talk about antediluvian rulers and divine ages. Open up the later Egyptian king lists, and you do not just get a neat sequence starting with Narmer and the First Dynasty and proceeding forward through history. You get whole ages stacked behind that, receding into a kind of cultivated golden mist. There is the age when the gods themselves ruled Egypt. Ra-Shu, Geb, Osiris. Then a group sometimes called the Venerables, the great ones of the north and the south. Then a shadowy, transitional category called the Shemsu-Hor, usually translated as the followers of Horus. Only after all of that does the familiar pharaonic history begin. The history that we can actually track in stone, in pottery, in inscriptions, in tombs. On paper, it looks beautifully organized, almost suspiciously so. Gods at the top, demigods in the middle, humans at the bottom. A clean descent from the divine to the mortal, with each category neatly separated and labeled. The problem is that our main sources for this scheme are not early. They are Egyptians looking back across a very long, very complicated history and trying to turn it into a straight line. The most famous source is the Turin Royal Canon, a fragile papyrus from the New Kingdom, dating to roughly the 13th century before the Common Era. It attempts to list rulers from the age of the gods all the way down to the king who was reigning when the papyrus was written. Large sections are destroyed. The papyrus is in pieces, but you can still see, in the surviving fragments, categories like those who were followers of Horus with improbably long totals of years attached to their supposed reigns. Then there is Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, under the Ptolemaic dynasty. We do not have his original work. It survives only in later summaries and quotations by other writers, which introduces another layer of potential distortion. But Manetho is the one who divides Egyptian history into the 30 dynasties that you see in every textbook. Before his first dynasty, he also places divine and semi-divine rulers whose reigns stretch back tens of thousands of years. Earlier temple inscriptions and tomb texts sometimes mention the Shemsu-Hor, but usually in passing. They are invoked as a revered group from the deep past, or as a kind of holy precedent. They are never described in the kind of detail that later kings receive. There are no biographies, no lists of their building projects, no accounts of their wars. They are more like a theological placeholder than a historical dynasty. So you have this peculiar structure. Very late documents that supposedly preserve very early memories, wrapped in religious language and inflated with enormous numbers. What do you do with that? One line of interpretation suggests that the Shemsu-Hor were not a lost dynasty at all, but an ancestral cult. In this reading, followers of Horus might refer to elite lineages in pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, families who claimed the falcon god Horus as their patron deity and whose leadership over local communities was later mythologized into a single, almost timeless category. When New Kingdom scribes looked back across the vast expanse of Egyptian history, they telescoped generations of local chieftains, priests, and clan heads into one mystical group that could sit neatly in the chronological space between the age of the gods and the age of the known pharaohs. Another interpretation frames the entire scheme as priestly chronology. By the New Kingdom and later periods, temple bureaucracies had to make sense of staggering amounts of inherited material. Old king lists, festival records, local traditions from dozens of nomes, the administrative districts of Egypt, theological schemes that trace the authority of specific gods back to the creation of the world, creating a long, ordered list of rulers, starting with gods, moving through semi-divine beings, and ending with human kings, was a way to impose structure on all of that inherited chaos. The Shemsu-Hor become a convenient bridge class, neither fully divine nor fully historical. They plug the holes in the timeline and align political history with cosmic theology. And of course, there is the political dimension. If you are a pharaoh whose power depends on being seen as Horus on earth, as the living manifestation of the falcon god, what better way to legitimize your rule than to claim an unbroken line of Horus followers stretching back into the deepest imaginable past? Embedding the Shemsu-Hor in official king lists turns a regional god's cult and its early elite adherents into the backbone of all Egyptian kingship. It is nation-building written in divine time. None of this means there was no real complexity in Egypt before the first dynasty. Quite the opposite. Archaeology in Upper Egypt, especially around the sites of Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, reveals a long, fascinating process of increasing hierarchy and state formation that unfolded over centuries before anyone named Narmer ever swung a ceremonial mace. In the Naqada culture, which spans roughly 1,000 years before the first dynasty, graves become progressively more differentiated. Some individuals receive bigger tombs, finer grave goods, imported luxury objects. Others receive almost nothing. The gap between rich and poor burials widens over time, suggesting the emergence of a social hierarchy that is hardening into something more permanent. Settlements grow. Fortified sites appear. Large ceremonial centers emerge, with evidence for organized ritual activity on a scale that goes well beyond what a single family or a small village could produce. At Hierakonpolis, there is a large elite cemetery and a monumental ceremonial precinct that dates to centuries before the first dynasty. At Abydos, the royal cemetery of the earliest dynasties sits right next to earlier, impressive tombs that already look like the resting places of powerful regional rulers, big men who controlled territory, commanded labor, and projected their authority through ritual and display. So the pre-dynastic period in Egypt is not a blank page. It is not a void waiting to be filled by mystical Shemsu-Hor or visiting Atlanteans. It is a richly documented, archaeologically visible sequence of increasing social complexity. Chiefs become kings. Local cults become state religions. Regional polities compete, merge, and eventually consolidate into something that looks like a unified state. The process is messy, violent, and takes centuries. It is also entirely legible in the dirt if you know where to look and what to look for. But here is the key point. That rich, complex, fascinating pre-dynastic period does not match what the later Egyptian texts describe when they talk about the Shemsuhor. The texts describe a single, unified, almost timeless group of semi-divine rulers who held the entire land together in a golden age. The archaeology shows a fractured landscape of competing regional powers, gradually and unevenly coming together through a combination of warfare, alliance, trade, and ritual competition. The texts give you a straight line. The dirt gives you a tangled web. That mismatch is not a failure of either the texts or the archaeology. It is a feature of how memory works across very long stretches of time. Oral traditions simplify. They flatten. They turn centuries of gradual change into clean narrative blocks. 100 local chieftains who ruled small stretches of the Nile Valley over 300 years become the followers of Horus, who ruled for thousands of years. The chaos of real political competition becomes the serene order of a golden age. The slow, incremental process of state formation becomes a single moment when kingship descended, or a single act of unification performed by a single heroic king. We see the same pattern everywhere. In Greece, a fractured landscape of Mycenaean palace states, each independently powerful, each with its own local traditions and rivalries, gets compressed by later Greek storytellers into the Age of Heroes. A single generation of demigods who sailed to Troy and fought together under a single high king. The archaeological Mycenaean world is messy, competitive, and spans centuries. The literary Mycenaean world is neat, unified, and occupies a single legendary generation. Both versions are connected to the same underlying reality. Neither one is a faithful photograph of what actually happened. This is how human memory manufactures golden ages. Not by inventing them from nothing, but by taking real, complex periods and stripping out the complications. The conflicts get smoothed over. The failures get edited out. The gradual transitions get replaced by clean, dramatic moments. And the whole thing gets pushed further and further back in time, acquiring a patina of sacredness and authority with every retelling, until it sits at the very beginning of the story, a luminous preface to everything that follows. So when we read Egyptian texts that describe a Zep Tepi, a first time when the gods walked the earth and established the foundations of civilization, we are not necessarily reading a garbled transmission from a lost super-civilization. We may be reading the end product of a very human, very well understood process of memory compression. Real events, real leaders, real achievements from the pre-dynastic period have been digested by centuries of priestly scholarship and theological reflection and turned into something grander, simpler, and more divine than whatever actually happened. That does not make the first time meaningless. It makes it deeply meaningful, but meaningful in a different way than a literal reading would suggest. It tells us what the Egyptians valued, what they wanted their origins to look like, how they understood the relationship between gods and humans, between the cosmic and the political, between the sacred past and the profane present. It is a window into the Egyptian soul. It is just not a window into a lost archaeological stratum. Now let us talk about the Greeks. Because the Greeks are the ones who gave us the most famous lost civilization story of all time, and understanding what they were actually doing when they told it requires us to understand something about how Greek culture processed information from older, more established civilizations. The Greeks of the classical period, the Athens of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the Sparta of the Peloponnesian War, were relative newcomers to the ancient Mediterranean world. They knew this. It bothered them. When Greek travelers visited Egypt and saw temples that were already ancient when the Parthenon was a building site, they felt something that we might recognize as civilizational anxiety, a nagging sense that their own culture, for all its brilliance, was young, recent, built on foundations laid by others. Herodotus, the father of history as the Romans called him, traveled through Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era and recorded what the priests told him. He was clearly impressed, and sometimes overwhelmed by the sheer depth of Egyptian time. The priest showed him lists of kings and told him stories about events that supposedly happened thousands of years before his visit. Herodotus did not always believe everything he was told. He was more skeptical than he is sometimes given credit for, but he recorded it. He passed it along. And in doing so, he became one of the channels through which Egyptian ideas about deep time flowed into Greek intellectual culture. Plato, writing a generation or two after Herodotus, took that sense of Egyptian antiquity and built something extraordinary with it. In two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, he tells the story of Atlantis. And this is where we need to be very, very careful. Because the Atlantis story has been so thoroughly colonized by modern myth-making, by movies and novels and television documentaries and New Age speculation, that most people have no idea what Plato actually wrote. They have a vague impression of a sunken continent, a technologically advanced civilization, crystal power, maybe some connection to aliens, and almost none of that has anything to do with the original text. Here is what Plato actually describes. In the Timaeus, the Athenian statesman Critias tells a story that he says was passed down in his family from his great-grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Neith in the city of Sais. Already, notice the chain of transmission. This is not eyewitness testimony. This is a story that has passed through at least 4 pairs of hands before it reaches us, each retelling an opportunity for distortion, embellishment, or selective emphasis. The Egyptian priests, according to the story, told Solon that the Greeks were children, that they had no truly ancient traditions because periodic catastrophes, floods, and fires destroyed their records and forced them to start over from scratch. The Egyptians, sheltered by the Nile and the stability of their environment, had preserved much older memories. And one of those memories concerned a great island power that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. 9,000 years before Solon. That would place the story around 9,600 before the Common Era, deep in the Pleistocene, deep in the last ice age, at a time when, according to everything archaeology and paleoclimatology can tell us, there were no cities, no states, no writing, no monumental architecture anywhere on Earth. Hunter-gatherers roamed landscapes that would later be transformed by agriculture. The idea that a sophisticated maritime empire existed at that date is, to put it mildly, extraordinary. The island, according to Plato, was called Atlantis. It lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, a statement that, if taken literally, describes something roughly the size of a small continent. It was ruled by a confederation of kings descended from the god Poseidon. It had elaborate architecture, concentric rings of water and land, harbors, temples covered in gold, silver, and the mysterious metal orichalcum, a powerful military, extensive trade networks. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, it sank beneath the sea and was gone. The story continues in the Critias, where Plato provides even more architectural and social detail about Atlantis before the dialogue breaks off, unfinished. We never get the ending. We never learn how the story was supposed to conclude. That incompleteness has fueled speculation for over 2,000 years. Now, what are we actually looking at here? The first thing to understand is genre. Plato is a philosopher. He is not a historian. He is not an archaeologist. He is not a geographer. He uses stories, including fictional stories, as vehicles for philosophical arguments. The Republic, his most famous work, contains an elaborate fictional city designed from scratch to illustrate his ideas about justice. The allegory of the cave, one of the most influential passages in all of Western philosophy, is explicitly presented as a made-up scenario designed to make a point about the nature of knowledge and reality. Plato invents scenarios constantly. It is one of his primary intellectual tools. The Atlantis story appears in dialogues that are explicitly about cosmology and the nature of the ideal state. The Timaeus contains an extended account of the creation of the universe. The Critias is supposed to show what an ideal ancient Athens would have looked like and how it would have behaved when confronted with a powerful aggressor. Atlantis, in this reading, is not a historical report. It is a literary device. It is the antagonist in a morality play about the corruption of power and the virtue of simplicity. Athens, portrayed as an ancient, modest, well-governed society, defeats Atlantis, portrayed as a wealthy, technologically advanced, but morally decadent empire. The message is not, look, there was a real island out there somewhere. The message is wealth and power without virtue lead to destruction. Many, probably most, classical scholars read the Atlantis story this way, as a Platonic myth, a thought experiment, a philosophical parable wrapped in the prestige of Egyptian antiquity to give it weight and authority. Plato needed his audience to take the story seriously as a vehicle for his ideas, so he framed it as ancient wisdom from the most ancient civilization the Greeks knew about. That framing is itself a rhetorical strategy, not a historical citation. But there are reasons why the story will not stay in its philosophical box. The level of specific detail is unusual for a Platonic myth. The concentric rings, the measurements, the metals, the political structure, the geographic location, the precise date. Plato's other myths and allegories tend to be more abstract, more obviously symbolic. The Atlantis story has a solidity, a specificity, that makes it feel different. It reads less like an allegory and more like a description, however distorted, of something that someone at some point actually saw or heard about. Then there is the question of the Egyptian source. Solon really did visit Egypt. That much is generally accepted. The idea that Egyptian priests told Greek visitors about their own, more ancient history is entirely plausible. We know that Egyptian temple institutions did preserve long records. We know that they did look down on the Greeks as cultural newcomers. We know that cross-cultural intellectual exchange between Egypt and Greece was a real phenomenon by the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. So it is possible, at least in principle, that Solon heard something in Egypt. Some story about a past catastrophe, a lost island, a vanished people. Whether what he heard bore any resemblance to what Plato eventually published is a completely separate question. Remember the chain of transmission. Egyptian priest to Solon, Solon to his family to Critias the Elder, Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, Critias the Younger to Plato, and then Plato, one of the most creative and philosophically ambitious minds in human history, shapes whatever he received into a story that serves his own intellectual purposes. At every link in that chain, the story can change. Details can be added. Numbers can be inflated. Geographic references can shift. The original kernel, if there was one, can be buried under layers of Greek interpretation, philosophical framing, and sheer literary invention until the final product bears almost no resemblance to whatever was originally said in a temple courtyard in Sais. Scholars have proposed dozens of real-world candidates for the kernel behind the Atlantis story. The most widely discussed is the Minoan eruption of Thera, the catastrophic volcanic explosion that destroyed the island of Santorini around 1600 before the Common Era and severely damaged Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. The Minoans were a sophisticated maritime power with impressive architecture, elaborate art, extensive trade networks, and a writing system that we still cannot fully read. Their sudden decline, possibly triggered or accelerated by the Thera eruption and its aftermath of tsunamis and ashfall, could plausibly have generated stories about a great island civilization destroyed by natural disaster. If you multiply Plato's 9,000 years by 10, you do not get a match. But if you read the 9,000 as 900, a simple error in translating Egyptian notation into Greek, you land much closer to the Minoan period. The geography does not match perfectly. Santorini is in the Aegean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles, but details can shift over centuries of retelling. An Aegean island becomes an Atlantic continent. A few decades of decline become a single day and night. A regional civilization becomes a world power. Other candidates have been proposed. The submerged Rikat structure in Mauritania, Bronze Age settlements in southern Spain, sunken landscapes in the North Sea, coastal sites on the Atlantic shelf. Each proposal has its advocates and its problems. None has produced the kind of unambiguous archaeological evidence that would settle the question. And that is the fundamental difficulty with Atlantis. The story is flexible enough to fit almost anywhere and almost anything. You can adjust the numbers. You can reinterpret the geography. You can invoke catastrophic sea level changes or localized tsunamis or seismic events. You can argue that the original location has been shifted, that the original date has been distorted, that the original description has been embellished beyond recognition. With enough interpretive freedom, you can make Atlantis fit the Ricat structure or the Azores or Antarctica or the Yucatan Peninsula or practically any other location on Earth where something interesting once happened and is now either underwater or in ruins. But that flexibility is itself a warning sign. A hypothesis that can explain everything explains nothing. If Atlantis can be anywhere, it is effectively nowhere. The story becomes a mirror rather than a window. It reflects whatever the person looking into it wants to see, rather than revealing something specific and testable about the actual past. What the Atlantis story does tell us, reliably and powerfully, is something about the Greeks themselves. It tells us that they were aware of being young, that they looked to Egypt for validation and depth, that they understood catastrophic loss, the idea that civilizations can vanish and their knowledge can be erased, that they were drawn to stories about golden ages and moral decline, that they used the deep past as a canvas on which to paint their own anxieties about power, wealth, and the fragility of human achievement. These are not trivial insights. They are profound. They tell us about the psychological landscape of the ancient Mediterranean world in a way that archaeological potsherds and stratigraphic sections cannot. But they do not tell us where Atlantis was, because Atlantis, as Plato describes it, may never have been anywhere. It may have always been a story about the fear of loss, dressed in the borrowed robes of Egyptian antiquity. Now let us pivot from text to terrain, from what ancient writers said to what the physical world actually shows us when we look at it with modern eyes. The end of the last ice age, roughly between 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, was not a gentle transition. It was a series of lurches, long periods of gradual warming punctuated by sudden, violent shifts. Meltwater pulses that raised sea levels by meters in the span of a few centuries. Cold snaps that reversed the warming trend for decades or centuries before the warming resumed. The climate system was not smoothly turning a dial from cold to warm. It was lurching between states, sometimes violently, in ways that would have been catastrophic for any human communities in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the wrong place, devastatingly, was often the best place. The places where early humans would have been most likely to concentrate, the low-lying coastal plains, the river deltas, the estuarine zones where fresh and salt water mix, the gently sloping continental shelves that ring every major landmass. Those were exactly the places that the rising seas would eventually swallow. Think about the scale of what was lost. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea levels were roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. That means every continent had more exposed land than it does now. Coastlines extended much farther out than their current positions. Entire landscapes that are now seabed were once dry land with rivers, lakes, forests, and almost certainly human inhabitants. The English Channel was dry land. You could walk from Britain to France. The North Sea was a vast, low-lying plain, sometimes called Doggerland by archaeologists, that was probably one of the richest habitats in northern Europe. Trawler nets in the North Sea still occasionally drag up mammoth teeth, flint tools, and even human remains from this drowned landscape. The Persian Gulf was dry, or at least much shallower than it is today. The Sunda Shelf, connecting the islands of Southeast Asia to the Asian mainland, was exposed, creating a vast tropical lowland called Sundaland that has since vanished beneath the waves. Australia was connected to New Guinea by a land bridge. Thousands of square kilometers of habitable, resource-rich land that once supported human life are now simply gone, submerged, unreachable without expensive submersible technology, buried under sediment, scoured by currents, invisible. We know people lived on those lands because we find their artifacts when they wash ashore or get caught in fishing nets. We know people were there because genetic and linguistic evidence tells us that populations must have moved across landscapes that no longer exist. We know they were there because the timing of human arrival in places like Australia and the Americas requires passage through or across territories that are now underwater. But we have almost no detailed archaeological information about what those people built, how they organized their societies, what kind of structures they erected, what kind of art they created. Any coastal settlement from the late Pleistocene or early Holocene that was situated below the modern sea level is gone. Not destroyed in a dramatic cataclysm, just slowly, relentlessly submerged as the glaciers melted and the oceans crept landward over thousands of years. This is the great archaeological blind spot of human prehistory. We have excellent data from inland sites, from caves and rock shelters and hilltop settlements that were safely above the rising waters. We have almost no data from the coastal lowlands where human populations were probably most concentrated. Our entire picture of what early humans were doing, how they were living, what they were capable of, is based on a biased sample. We are looking at the highlands and the interiors and drawing conclusions about all of humanity, while the richest, most populated zones are sitting under 40 meters of salt water, unsurveyed and largely unknown.